lived a woman by the name of Chizma. She had many maids and house helpers to attend to her every need. However, despite her wealth and the hard-working helpers, she treated them harshly and showed no appreciation for their hard work. Chizma would often shout at them and demand perfection without showing any gratitude. The workers tried to do their best, but Chizma's expectations were never met, and she would always find something to complain about. Chizma's harsh behavior started after an incident when she was much younger. Her youthful years were marked by a deep desire to please and earn love. She believed that by being devoted and serving others, she would find the attention and affection she so longed for. Unfortunately, she was deceived and betrayed by someone she held dear, someone she had trusted wholeheartedly. This betrayal left a deep wound in her heart, making her feel vulnerable and hurt. In the aftermath, she put up an impenetrable wall, determined to never feel that kind of pain again. When Chizma met her husband, it was far from easy. Having been deeply hurt and betrayed in the past, she was guarded and distrustful towards him, unable to let her guard down and fully open her heart to him. Her fear of being hurt again made her resistant to the idea of trusting and loving someone new. It was a challenge for her husband, who had to work hard to break down her walls and prove his loyalty and sincerity. After Chizma and her husband, Mr. Martin, got married, she moved into his beautiful mansion. He told her that he would hire some housemaids to take care of things around the house, but Chizma initially opposed to the idea of hiring house help, as she had negative experiences in the past with people she trusted. She argued that she could manage the house chores herself and she didn't need any help. Her husband, however, insisted that the workload was too much for her to handle alone and that having some assistance would take some of the burden off her shoulders. Chizma finally agreed, but with a heavy heart. Despite her initial hesitance to accept house help, after a while, Chizma found herself relishing the power and authority she had over them. She enjoyed the thought of being able to boss others around and have her every command fulfilled by them. As the years went by, Chizma's reputation as a harsh and unfair employer spread throughout the community. People started to avoid the big house, as no one would want to work for such a woman. Her husband, Mr. Martin, tried to reason with her by letting her know that the way she was treating her housemaids was wrong, but Chizma refused to listen. She carried on with her distasteful ways, and so some of her housemaids could no longer endure her abuse and quit their jobs. One of the maids Chizma especially disliked was a young, headstrong woman named Neka. Neka was known for her hard work and dedication, but Chizma would often belittle her and make her feel insecure about her abilities. She would give Neka extra work to do or blame her for mistakes that weren't her fault. Despite her best effort, Neka could never please Chizma and always felt like she was walking on eggshells around her. Neka thought about quitting on many occasions, but she needed the job. Chizma realized that her workers were leaving and that no one was coming to the house for employment. The ones here are desperate, I see, she said to herself. Oh well, I better be careful before they all leave and I have no one left to take care of this house, she continued. One day, Chizma's husband entered the house and found Neka sitting alone in a corner crying. He was taken aback and asked Neka what was wrong. Neka tried to hide her tears, but eventually confessed that she was having a hard time working for Chizma. She explained how Chizma had been constantly criticizing her and making her feel small and unworthy. Mr. Martin felt sorry for Neka and was horrified that his wife had been treating her that way. He knew that Chizma had a habit of being demanding and sometimes cold, but he had no idea it had gotten this bad. He promised Neka that he would talk to his wife and try to make things better. Later that day, Mr. Martin approached Chizma and told her that he had found Neka crying in the house. He explained to Chizma that he had overheard Neka complaining about how Chizma had been treating her. Chizma was a little embarrassed as she had not expected her husband to find out about how she was treating her workers. Chizma remained defensive throughout the conversation and denied that she had been treating Neka or any of the housemaids unfairly. She said that Neka was just a whiny complainer who couldn't handle a little bit of criticism. Mr. Martin was dismayed by Chizma's attitude and tried to make her understand how her behavior was affecting Neka and the other workers in the house. He reminded her that she had a responsibility to treat all of her workers with respect and kindness, as they were the ones who helped her maintain her household and lifestyle. She promised she would do better going forward and asked for his forgiveness. Yet that promise did not last for long. When Mr. Martin was away on business trips, Chizma would often throw lavish parties at the house, inviting her wealthy friends. She loved to show off her wealth and status and would go all out on food, decor, and entertainment. Chizma would often enlist the help of her housemaids to prepare the feast and serve her guests. The parties would often last for hours, with guests drinking and chatting until late in the night. Chizma would play the role of the perfect hostess, charming her guests with her wit and hospitality. However, her housemaids would have to work tirelessly throughout the night, cleaning up after the guests and ensuring everything was perfect. The house would be in disarray, with food and drinks spilled everywhere and furniture knocked over. They would have to work in the wee hours of the morning to ensure everything was back in order before Mr. Martin returned home. Mr. Martin returned home unexpectedly from one of his trips. He immediately suspected that Chizma had thrown a party while he was away. He pulled Neka aside and asked her if anything had happened while he was gone, and Neka, feeling tired and frustrated with Chizma's behavior, told him everything about the party. Mr. Martin was shocked and angry to hear about the extravagant party that his wife had thrown, and the way she had worked her staff to the bone. He felt deeply saddened and disappointed that his wife was still treating the workers so badly. Why is she behaving like this? He wondered. Mr. Martin knew that he needed to confront Chizma about this, but he wasn't sure how. Chizma was a tough and stubborn woman, and he knew that she would deny and defend herself. He spent the next few days trying to lift the spirits of his hardworking staff who had been treated unfairly. He also realized that no one was coming to apply for a job at the house, and it would be a disaster if the remaining staff quit their jobs. After much thought and deliberation, Mr. Martin decided it was time to sit down with Chizma and have a serious conversation. The next day, he waited for Chizma to come home from her shopping trip. As she walked through the door, he firmly asked her to come with him to the sitting room. Chizma sensed that something was amiss and followed Mr. Martin into the sitting room, feeling a little uneasy about the serious expression on his face. Once they were alone, Mr. Martin sat down next to Chizma on a sofa and took a deep breath. "Chizma," he said, "I need to talk to you about something important." Chizma looked at her husband curiously and nodded, preparing herself for whatever he was about to say. Mr. Martin took another deep breath and continued. "I've heard some pretty disturbing things about you. Why are you still mistreating the workers?" he asked her. "Don't you see that they're leaving because of your nasty attitude?" he continued. "You asked for forgiveness and said you were going to change, but I see that was a lie." Chizma's expression remained cold and impassive. "What exactly have you heard?" she asked coolly. Mr. Martin told Chizma about the parties she'd been having while he was away on his business trips. Chizma listened in silence as her husband listed out all the details of the lavish parties she had thrown while he was away. At first, she tried to deny and defend herself as usual, claiming that she was just having a little bit of fun. But as Mr. Martin continued to give specific examples, Chizma's defenses began to waver and she started to look uncomfortable. Mr. Martin pressed on, telling her about how the workers had been made to work through the night to clean up after the parties, and how they had been treated poorly and worked to the bone. Chizma's face became more and more flushed as she heard the evidence piling up against her. She tried to argue that the servants were being paid to do their jobs and that she wasn't abusing them in any way. She realized that all the information about her parties and the mistreatment of the maids must have come from Neka. She was furious at the thought of Neka going behind her back and telling her husband about her behavior. "That little traitor," Chizma hissed. "Neka told you everything, didn't she?" "She did," Mr. Martin replied, his voice firm. "And I have to say, I am shocked and disappointed in you, Chizma. I never thought you could be so cruel and uncaring towards your employees." He stood up and walked away without even looking at her. Mr. Martin took some time off from work, and for the entire time he was at home, everything was going well in his home. The workers seemed happier and more at peace. However, things were about to take a turn for the worse when he had to go back to work. Mr. Martin went away on another business trip, and Chizma took that opportunity to fire Neka. Before Mr. Martin left for his trip, he had hoped that his talk with Chizma would make her reflect on her behavior and change for the better. But to his dismay, Mr. Martin called the house a few days later and found out that Chizma had fired Neka the same day he had left for his trip. On the day she fired Neka, the young woman had been working tirelessly as usual, doing her best to keep up with Chizma's demanding requests and constant criticisms. As the day wore on, Neka started to feel more and more frustrated and unappreciated by Chizma. Later that day, when Chizma was done shouting at Neka for some minor mistakes she had made, Neka finally snapped and spoke back to her, defending herself and expressing her discontent. This was the final straw for Chizma. In an instant, Chizma's cold, icy demeanor hardened even more. She looked at Neka with a disapproving glare and said, "I've had enough of your back talk. You're fired, effective immediately. Pack your things and get out of my house." Neka went to her room to pack her belongings. She felt a mix of sadness and disbelief as she walked back to her small room. She was upset about being fired, but also relieved to be finally free from Chizma's tyrannical behavior. As she packed her belongings in a small bag, she thought about where she would go and what she would do next. Chizma stood at the doorway and watched as Neka was packing. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed a small mark on Neka's shoulder as she was packing her belongings. It was a familiar shape that Chizma had seen once before. As Neka packed her last few items into her bag, Chizma spoke up. "Wait a minute. What's that on your shoulder?" Neka froze, a look of dread spreading across her face as she touched the small mark on her shoulder. She knew exactly what Chizma was referring to. "It's just a birthmark," Neka replied, keeping her back turned towards Chizma. Chizma stepped closer. "I've seen that mark before. Let me see," she said. Chizma gasped and memories came rushing in. Years before, when Chizma was young and carefree, she had been in a relationship with a man who seemed like the love of her life. He led Chizma to believe that he was from a wealthy family, but that was far from the truth. She later discovered she was pregnant, and the man abandoned her immediately as he could not support her and her baby in any way, leaving Chizma to deal with her pregnancy all on her own. Soon after Chizma gave birth, she was devastated to find out that the doctors had proclaimed her baby dead. The news had been a devastating blow, and Chizma had never fully recovered from the experience. Over the years, she had often wondered what her baby would have been like if it had been a boy or a girl, and what life would have been like if she had not been abandoned by the father. After giving birth and discovering that her child had died, Chizma was left all alone, with no one to turn to for help. Her family had refused to associate with her once they learned about her pregnancy, and her boyfriend's family chased her away, making her feel even more isolated and abandoned. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, Chizma had to fend for herself, facing the harsh realities of life without any emotional support or guidance. It was a difficult and lonely period in her life, and one that she rarely spoke about. The experience of being pregnant and abandoned, followed by the loss of her baby, had a profound impact on Chizma. The pain and hurt she felt had left her bitter and cold, and she had slowly built up a tough outer shell to protect herself from being vulnerable and hurt again. As the years went by, Chizma grew even more closed off and reserved, rarely letting anyone see the broken girl inside. She had become a hard and unapproachable woman, with a sharp tongue and a cold heart until Mr. Martin came along. She stared at Neka, suspicion and anger bubbling beneath her cold exterior. "Where are you from? Tell me about your family," she demanded. Neka shifted nervously under Chizma's intense gaze. When questioned about her family, Neka revealed that she grew up in an orphanage after her parents died in a tragic car accident. Life in the orphanage had not been easy. The caretakers had mistreated her, making her time there challenging. Desperate to get away from the abusive environment, Neka eventually decided to leave the orphanage and strike out on her own. Chizma was very curious as Neka reminded her so much of the boy who abandoned her, and the birthmark was very familiar. She never forgot that, as her mother had the same birthmark on her shoulder. Chizma stood, transfixed as Neka spoke, her mind racing with a mixture of emotions. The young woman's story had stirred up some deep, painful memories for Chizma, and the sight of the birthmark had sent a chill down her spine. As she listened to Neka's every word, Chizma couldn't help but wonder if her child, the one she had lost decades ago, had survived after all. The thought shook Chizma to the core, but she tried to push it away, telling herself it couldn't be true. Yet the birthmark, the same marking as her mother, continued to haunt her thoughts, making her doubt everything she thought she knew. Despite her growing suspicions, Chizma remained silent, her mind spinning with questions and fears. She couldn't bear the thought of getting her hopes up, only to have them dashed again if she were wrong. She continued to watch Neka, her eyes glued to the now covered birthmark, as if it held the key to all her secrets and doubts. Chizma's heart was conflicted, torn between disbelief and the slim possibility that her child might have survived after all. She gathered the courage to ask her the next question. "Neka," she began, her voice quivering slightly, "I need to know, were your parents your biological parents?" The question seemed to startle Neka, who looked up at Chizma with a mix of surprise and confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice laced with apprehension. "I mean," Chizma took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "Were you adopted?" Neka told her that she was adopted. Her real parents were drug addicts, so her adoptive parents placed them in rehab and raised her. A look of surprise crossed Chizma's face as Neka confirmed that she had been adopted. "Your real parents were drug addicts, you say?" she repeated, her voice heavy with the weight of all the memories and pain. As Neka shared the details of her adoption, Chizma's heart grew heavy with shock and anger. The more she heard, the more she realized the full extent of the duplicity and deceit that had been at play during Neka's birth and adoption. She broke down after realizing that Neka could be her long-lost child. As the truth of Neka's situation sank in, Chizma could feel her stoic facade crumble and the weight of her long-buried emotions come crashing down on her. Tears swelled up in her eyes as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The possibility that the child she had lost so many years ago might still be alive sent shockwaves through Chizma's heart and shook her to the core. All the pain and suffering she had endured over the years seemed to come rushing back to her, overwhelming her with a mix of hope and despair. It was a moment of both revelation and anguish as Chizma grappled with the thought that her child had been alive all along, only to be taken from her by an act of deception and cruelty. Chizma stared at Neka, her eyes watery and her voice trembling as she spoke. "You know, there's something about you that's been bothering me," she began, her voice low and shaky. "You look so much like someone I once knew, a boy from long ago." Chizma's heart felt heavy as she recounted her past to Neka. "I was pregnant once," she said, her voice quivering slightly. "I was with a boy whom I thought loved me, but when he found out that I was pregnant, he abandoned me. My own family turned their backs on me as well, leaving me all alone." Chizma's voice was soft and shaky as she spoke, the emotions of the past still lingering deep within her. "I've been treating you so harshly. It's not just because of your mistakes at work. It's also because you look so much like him. It brings back painful memories." She continued, "When I first saw you, something about your face reminded me so much of him. And then when I saw the birthmark, it was just like my mother's. It brought back all the pain and hurt I had suppressed for so long." Chizma looked at Neka, her eyes pleading. "Please," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I need to know. Would you be willing to do a blood test?" She paused, her voice quavering as she continued. "I truly need to know if you're my daughter, the baby I thought was lost years ago." Chizma's heart was pounding in her chest as she waited for Neka's response, silently praying that she would agree to do the blood test. The tension hung heavy in the air as Chizma and Neka stood facing each other, each lost in their own thoughts and feelings. It was a moment of truth, a potential turning point in both of their lives, and all Chizma could do was wait anxiously for Neka's answer. "Please," Chizma repeated, her voice softer but still trembling. "Say yes." Chizma sighed with relief as Neka nodded and agreed to do the blood test. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice laced with emotion. "Thank you for agreeing to this. It means so much to me." Neka could see the raw emotion in Chizma's face, the hope and fear in her eyes, and she knew that this moment was significant for both of them. The two women stood there in silence for a few moments, the weight of their decision hanging heavily between them. Neka told Chizma that she needed a few days to process things and that she would come back so that they could do the blood test. A few days later, Chizma and Neka made their way to the hospital, their hearts pounding in their chests with anticipation and anxiety. Chizma felt like her whole world was hanging in the balance as they walked through the sterile hallways, the scent of antiseptic filling her nostrils. As they arrived at the laboratory, Chizma and Neka were seated in a waiting room, the air thick with tension and unspoken thoughts. Time seemed to slow down as they waited, the minutes ticking by like hours. 3 days after they took the blood test, the women went back to the hospital lab. The test results seemed like they were taking forever, each passing moment adding to the suspense and uncertainty. Chizma fidgeted in her seat, her fingers drumming on the armrest as she tried to keep her emotions in check. Finally, a nurse called their names, breaking the silence that descended. Chizma's heart leaped into her throat as they stood up and followed the nurse to the lab room. This was it. This was the moment of truth. Chizma glanced at Neka, who was visibly nervous but trying to stay calm. The nurse instructed them to wait a moment while she retrieved their blood test result. The silence in the room was deafening as they waited. The only sound was the steady beeping of a monitor somewhere in the background. Chizma's mind was racing with thoughts and emotions, every scenario playing out in her head. Finally, the nurse returned and handed Chizma the results. Chizma's hands were shaking as she took the paper, her eyes scanning the page for the answer she had been both dreading and hoping for. Her heart was in her throat as she studied the results, her eyes darting back and forth. It felt like an eternity, but in reality, only a few seconds had passed. And then, finally, she found what she was looking for. There, in black and white, were the results of the blood test. Chizma's eyes widened as she read the words on the page, her eyes brimming with tears as she looked at Neka. The realization that this person who had crossed her path so unexpectedly was actually her long-lost daughter was too much to process. Chizma's heart was filled with a mixture of joy, relief, and sadness as she looked at Neka. She had spent years wondering, aching for the child she thought she had lost, and now here she was, staring at the living proof of the life she had created all those years ago. Tears streamed down Chizma's face as she looked at Neka, a mixture of emotions coursing through her. She could hardly believe that this moment was real, that she was actually looking at her long-lost daughter. The emotions were so profound that Chizma found herself breaking down, the years of pain and longing finally finding release in those tears. And then Chizma did something that she hadn't done in a long time. She reached out and hugged Neka, pulling her close and clinging to her tightly. Neka, caught off guard at first, instinctively melted into Chizma's embrace. The feeling of being held by someone who was now her mother, someone she barely knew yet felt a deep connection to, was oddly familiar and comforting. After the emotional reunion with Neka, Chizma felt a sense of clarity and peace that she hadn't felt in years. She knew she needed to come clean with Mr. Martin. 1 week later, Mr. Martin returned from his trip. Chizma's mind was still reeling from the revelation of Neka's true identity, but she knew she needed to share the news with him. Gathering her thoughts, she found her husband and took him aside to talk. Chizma nervously recounted the entire story from the first moment she had seen Neka to the realization that Neka was her daughter, and the blood test that had confirmed it all. The words spilled out of her in a rush, her emotions raw and unfiltered. Mr. Martin listened intently, his expression stoic as he processed the information. When Chizma finished speaking, he paused for a moment before finally muttering, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Chizma's heart sank at the disappointment in her husband's voice. She knew she had kept a secret from him that was significant, and the fact that he had to find out from her now, after all these years, was painful. Mr. Martin wanted to know what occurred between Neka's adoptive parents and the doctors at the hospital. His determination led him to hire a renowned private investigator, renowned for their success and skill in uncovering hidden truth. He hoped that the investigator's extensive resources and expertise would shed light on the mysterious events that had taken place during Neka's birth. The private investigator's relentless efforts led them to locate a nurse who was deeply involved in the baby trading business. Feeling guilty and seeking absolution, the nurse confessed to her crime and provided the investigator with crucial documents and evidence. The nurse, now close to the end of her life, viewed this as her atonement and punishment for her past transgressions. Based on the evidence, Neka's adoptive parents, who were wealthy but struggled with fertility issues, had made arrangements with the doctors and nurses at the hospital where Neka was born. They promised a significant amount of money in exchange for a healthy baby girl. The hospital staff, motivated by greed, agreed to go along with the plan, and soon a healthy baby girl was delivered, who was revealed to be Neka. Because Chizma was alone, young, poor, and facing difficult circumstances, it was easy for the doctors and nurses to manipulate her. They fed her lies about her infant's fate. They told her that her baby had passed shortly after birth, all the while knowing that they had arranged for the wealthy family to adopt her instead. Chizma had no choice but to believe the doctors and nurses who told her the devastating news about her baby. Both Chizma and Neka were absolutely shattered upon discovering the truth. Chizma collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face, consumed by a mixture of pain and disbelief. Mr. Martin, sensing their anguish, immediately rushed to their side and drew them into his embrace, providing comfort and solace to the two broken souls. As he held them, he could feel their grief, knowing that this revelation had shaken the very foundation of their world. Despite the fact that Neka was not his biological daughter, Mr. Martin couldn't help but feel a strong connection to her. Perhaps it was the knowledge of her true origins or the way she spoke and carried herself. Whatever the reason, Mr. Martin found himself embracing Neka warmly, the love of a father for a daughter evident in his actions. And so the drama had reached its end. Chizma, her heart finally at peace, found herself content with the knowledge that Neka, her long-lost daughter, was now a part of their lives. Mr. Martin, too, had accepted Neka as his own, the bond of a father and daughter beginning to form. Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming back to our channel. I hope you really enjoyed this wonderful tale. Remember, it doesn't cost a dime to be kind. I'll see you in the next one. Be blessed.